The moment Ethan Vale walked into that delivery room and checked his watch, instead of holding his newborn son's hand, Mara knew. Not suspected, not feared, knew. He stood at the foot of the hospital bed, phone pressed to his ear, voice dropped to a murmur she wasn't supposed to catch. And he looked at their son 7 weeks early, 4 pounds 11 ounces, fighting for every breath in that incubator, the way a man looks at a problem he hasn't figured out how to solve yet. That was the moment everything cracked open. Not the affair, not the hidden accounts, not even the folder she would find 3 weeks later with her name written across the top in red ink custody strategy as though she were a liability to be managed. It was that look. A father who couldn't be bothered to be present for the first hour of his son's life. That was when Mara Bennett Vale began to understand exactly what kind of man she had married, and exactly how far she was willing to go to make it right. If you've ever loved someone who used that love against you, stay with me. This story is for you. If this is your first time on this channel, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Give this video a like if it moves you, and drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Mara Bennett grew up understanding that everything good in life came at a cost. She understood it in her bones, the way people who've actually worked for things understand it, not as a philosophy, but as a fact as plain and unglamorous as the Arizona dirt her grandfather used to scrape from his boots on the back porch of the ranch house every evening before supper. Her grandfather, Frank Bennett, had built that ranch with 60 years of labor. Not wealthy man labor, not the kind that gets romanticized in magazines. Real labor. The kind that left calluses on your hands and an ache in your lower back that never fully went away. He'd raised cattle, leased parcels of the land to neighboring farmers, and kept meticulous records in a leather ledger that Mara used to trace her fingers over as a child. Not understanding the numbers, but understanding what they meant, that her family had built something real, something that belonged to them, something no one could take. He died when Mara was 19. Left the ranch and everything on it to her mother, Patricia, with the understanding that it would pass to Mara when the time came. What Mara didn't know, what no one in her family knew, was that 2 years before Frank Bennett died, a man named Gerald Vale had walked onto that property with a briefcase, a friendly smile, and a set of documents that had been very carefully altered. Gerald Vale was Ethan's father. But Mara wouldn't learn that for another 8 years. By then, she'd already married his son. She met Ethan at a hospital fundraiser in Manhattan, 3 years into her nursing career at Bellevue. She'd been working emergency for 2 of those years, and she'd learned quickly that the only way to survive that environment was to keep your edges sharp and your empathy carefully rationed, not because you didn't care, but because you cared so much that you had to protect yourself from it constantly. Ethan had been different from every man she'd met in New York. That was the honest truth of it, and she could admit it even now, even knowing what she knew. He had been magnetic in a way that had nothing to do with his money or his penthouse, or the way every person in a room seemed to orient toward him, like plants toward a light source. He had looked at her, really looked at her, not through her, not past her, not at her body or her dress or whatever she represented to him in that moment, and asked her what the worst part of her job was, not what she loved about it, not the heroic version. The worst part, she'd told him, the waiting. The families in the hallway who needed answers, she couldn't give them yet. The specific helplessness of standing beside someone who was slipping away and knowing that everything you were doing was technically correct and might still not be enough. He'd listened without flinching. That sounds like a particular kind of loneliness, he'd said. She'd thought, this man understands things. She'd been 27. She'd been wrong in the particular way that intelligent, capable women are sometimes wrong about men who present themselves as exceptions completely. And for a long time. They dated for 14 months. He was attentive in ways she hadn't expected, remembering small things she'd mentioned once in passing, showing up at the hospital with coffee on the nights she worked doubles, making her feel, for the first time in years, like someone was genuinely paying attention to her existence rather than what she could provide. The control came slowly. That was the thing about Ethan Vale. He was patient. He didn't take, he suggested. He didn't demand, he guided. He never raised his voice. He never issued ultimatums. He simply arranged things, very gently and very consistently, until the arrangement suited him. They married in a small ceremony in Tucson, close to what remained of her mother's property. The land had been sold years earlier. Patricia had told her, though she'd never gotten a clear answer about why or to whom. Ethan had insisted on the prenuptial agreement as a practical measure, and her attorney, at the time a junior associate at a firm, Ethan, had quietly referred her to, though she hadn't known that then had told her the terms were standard. They were not standard. She understood that now. For 3 years, Mara had lived in a marriage that looked, from the outside, like the kind women were supposed to want. The penthouse on the 43rd floor, with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, the charity events. The way Ethan introduced her to his colleagues, my wife, Mara, she's a nurse. Brilliant woman, the possessiveness wrapped so neatly in apparent pride that she hadn't seen it for what it was until much later. What she'd felt inside that marriage was a slow, progressive reduction. Her name wasn't on the deed to the penthouse. He'd explained that was for tax purposes. Her name wasn't on the investment accounts. He'd explained that was for liability protection. Her credit was run through a supplementary card tied to his primary account. He'd explained that was simpler. Every explanation had been reasonable. Every explanation had also left her with slightly less than she'd had before. She'd kept working that had been her one non-negotiable, the thing she'd refused to surrender, though Ethan had made it quietly, persistently uncomfortable. Scheduling events on her shift nights, implying, without ever saying directly, that her colleagues weren't the kind of people who should be close to their marriage. Expressing concern, in that careful way of his, about whether emergency nursing was sustainable long-term for someone who wanted a family. She'd wanted a family. He'd known that. So when she'd gotten pregnant, 18 months into their marriage, she'd felt something she was almost ashamed to admit to now: relief. The idea that a child might soften the architecture of their life together, that Ethan might have less time to manage the details of her existence if there was someone new requiring his attention. She had been wrong about that too. The pregnancy changed Ethan in the opposite direction of what she'd hoped. He became more focused, more deliberate, more controlled. He hired a private OB without consulting her. He insisted on attending every appointment and asking most of the questions himself, leaving Mara in the strange position of being a medical professional who sat quietly while her husband interrogated her doctor. He read parenting books. He compiled schedules. He discussed the nursery, the nanny candidates, the preschool options, all of it, with a precision that felt less like excitement and more like the planning of a logistics operation. She tried to discuss it with him once carefully over dinner. "I feel like I'm being managed," she said. He looked up from his phone. "You're 8 months pregnant, Mara. I'm trying to handle things so you don't have to. I want to handle things. Why, you're exhausted. Let me do this." She dropped it. She was exhausted. There was something seductive, even at this stage, about someone offering to carry the weight, even when the way he carried it left no room for her hands. But 2 weeks before her due date, she found the receipt. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been looking for the insurance card, which she kept in the drawer of his nightstand, because that was where they'd agreed to keep important documents, and the nightstand was the closest surface to the bed where she'd been trying, unsuccessfully, to heave herself upright at 11:30 at night. The receipt was from a restaurant she'd never been to. Dinner for two, the kind of place where dinner for two cost $400. The date was a Thursday. Ethan had told her he was at a client dinner on that Thursday, which was technically true, she supposed. She photographed it with her phone and put it back where she'd found it. She didn't say anything. She had learned in 3 years of marriage to this man that the worst thing you could do with evidence was tip your hand too early. She went to work the next morning. She had a double shift. 7:43 in the evening, her water broke in the middle of a trauma intake, and by 9 p. she was in a labor and delivery suite, 6 floors above the emergency department, where she worked, 7 weeks ahead of schedule, contracting every 4 minutes and calling Ethan's cell phone. He answered on the 3rd call. "I'm in the middle of something," he said first. Then a beat later, registering. "Wait, what?" He arrived 2 hours later. Their son 4 pounds, 11 ounces, breathing too fast. Taken immediately to the NICU, had been in the world for 90 minutes by the time Ethan walked through the door. He walked to the incubator first, stood there for a long moment. Then he looked at Mara and he said, "He's small. He's 7 weeks early, Ethan. Is he going to be okay?" "They think so. The doctors said he's doing well for his gestational age." Ethan nodded. His jaw worked slightly. He looked back at the incubator, and his phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out and looked at it. And then he stepped away from her toward the window and pressed it to his ear and dropped his voice. Mara lay in the hospital bed and watched her husband stand 6 feet from their newborn son and take a business call. She told herself she was too exhausted to feel it fully. She told herself she was in shock. She told herself a lot of things in that moment that were gentle lies, the kind she'd been telling herself for 3 years. But underneath all of it was something very quiet and very clear. I cannot do this anymore. They named him Miles. Her choice offered, Ethan's agreement, given without enthusiasm. Miles Bennett Vale, because she'd insisted on Bennett, and Ethan had let that one go, in the way he occasionally let small things go to demonstrate his reasonableness. She spent 5 days in the hospital with Miles in the NICU, and in those 5 days Ethan visited 4 times. He was unfailingly polite to the nurses. He brought her food she hadn't asked for. He made several long phone calls in the waiting area. On the 3rd day, a doctor stopped to speak with her, not her OB, but a physician she half recognized from around the hospital, an older woman named Dr. Naomi Mercer, whose specialty was internal medicine, but who had the particular manner of someone who'd spent enough years in hospitals to recognize things that had nothing to do with medicine. Dr. Mercer had been at the nurse's station when Ethan arrived that afternoon. She'd watched him come in. She'd watched his interaction with Mara through the glass. She came in after he left. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to know you can tell me to mind my own business, doctor," Mercer said. Mara was nursing Miles, who was finally off the breathing support and doing better, and she looked up. "How long has he been like that?" Dr. Mercer asked. Mara didn't ask who she meant or what she meant. She said 3 years. Dr. Mercer sat down. She didn't offer advice. She didn't offer diagnoses. She just stayed for 40 minutes, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with Ethan. And when she left, she put a business card on the side table and said, "Call me if you need anything. I mean anything." That card was the first handhold. 3 weeks after Miles came home, Mara found the second one. She'd been sorting through the diaper bag that Ethan's assistant had packed. She hadn't been able to bring herself to touch it until now. Too exhausted and overwhelmed and quietly drowning in the specific loneliness of being home in a 43rd floor penthouse with a husband who treated the baby's arrival the way he treated a new business venture, with intense organizational interest and almost no emotional investment, and tucked between 2 travel-sized packages of wipes was a folded receipt from a hotel in Midtown. 1 room, 2 nights. The dates lined up with a conference Ethan had told her he was attending in Boston. She photographed that too. Then she called Calder Shaw. She hadn't known Calder Shaw was an attorney when she'd worked on him in the emergency department 14 months earlier. She'd known he was critical. She'd known he was hemorrhaging internally from a car accident on the West Side Highway. And she'd known that the next 40 minutes were going to determine whether he went home or didn't. He'd gone home. Sent a card a few weeks later, the handwritten kind, which almost no one did anymore. And she'd tucked it in the back of a drawer and forgotten about it until she was standing in her kitchen at midnight with a hotel receipt in her hand and a sleeping baby on the monitor and a husband she no longer recognized. And she'd gone looking for the card because she'd needed the name. Calder Shaw, Family and Civil Litigation. She'd called the number on the card at 6:15 in the morning because she knew he was the type who started early. He answered. He remembered her immediately. She told him she needed a consultation. She told him she needed it to be confidential. She told him she was an emergency nurse who'd spent 3 years in a marriage she was beginning to understand she'd never fully consented to. He said, "Tell me everything," she told him. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. "Then, Mara, I need you to do something. Don't move any money. Don't confront him. Don't change your behavior at all. And send me everything you have." She sent everything she had. Wasn't much. Not yet. But she had learned in 2 years of emergency nursing that the difference between patients who made it and patients who didn't was rarely one dramatic intervention. It was the accumulation of small correct decisions made consistently over time. She began making them. Over the next 6 weeks, she documented quietly and carefully. She photographed documents when Ethan left his briefcase open. She made note of dates, absences, inconsistencies in what he told her versus what the credit card statements showed. The statements she technically had access to through their joint supplementary account, which Ethan had apparently forgotten, was visible to her. She tracked his phone habits without letting him see her track them. She stopped bringing up problems. She stopped showing frustration. She became, on the surface, the most agreeable version of herself she'd ever performed. And every night, after Ethan fell asleep, she sat in the nursery with Miles and allowed herself 10 minutes of being completely honest about how frightened she was. Then she'd put it away and go back to work. Dr. Mercer helped. Not with documentation, she was careful to keep Naomi at arm's length from the legal elements, but with something harder to quantify. Twice a week, when Ethan thought Mara was at a postnatal checkup, she sat in Naomi's office and talked without editing herself. Naomi had seen enough in 30 years of medicine to know what coercive control looked like without calling it that, without turning it into a clinical framework that would have felt distancing and wrong. She just listened and asked the right questions. "What would you do?" Naomi asked. One afternoon in late October, "If you could do anything?" Mara thought about it seriously. "I'd take Miles somewhere safe. I'd figure out what I'm actually entitled to. And I'd understand why he married me." Naomi looked at her. "You think there's a specific reason?" "There's always a specific reason with men like Ethan." Mara paused. "I just don't know what it is yet." She was closer to the answer than she realized. Calder had been pulling at threads in the financial documents she'd sent him. And in early November, he called her while Ethan was at the gym. The one reliable hour she had to herself, most mornings. And his voice had a quality she'd started to learn to read. Careful, measured. The voice of a man who had found something he hadn't expected to find. "I need to ask you about your grandfather's ranch," Calder said. She went still. "What about it? Your mother sold it before she passed?" "That's what I was always told." "Do you know who she sold it to?" Mara's grip on the phone tightened. "She never gave me a specific name. I assumed it was a developer. The property had been appraised for." "Mara." Calder's voice was very steady. "I'm looking at a property transfer record from 19 years ago. The transaction was facilitated through a shell company called Valcroft Holdings LLC. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. "Valcroft," she said. "That's a portmanteau of Vale and the Crawford being Ethan's mother's maiden name. The company was dissolved 8 years ago, but the trail is there if you know how to look." A pause. "The ranch was transferred to Valcroft for 40 cents on the dollar of its assessed value, based on appraisal documents that were significantly altered. Your grandfather's original deed is in the county record. The purchase agreement used a different version." Mara sat down on the kitchen floor, not dramatically, just because her legs decided not to hold her for a moment. "He knew," she said, "before he met me. He knew whose granddaughter I was. That's what the timeline suggests. His father acquired the property. Ethan would have known about it. He sought you out." She thought about the fundraiser. Ethan across the room watching her. Particular directness of his attention. How she'd thought this man sees me. He'd seen her. He'd recognized her. "Calder," she said. "What does this mean legally?" "It means," he said carefully, "that the foundation of a significant portion of the Vale family fortune was built on a fraudulent transaction. And you, as Frank Bennett's heir, potentially have a claim." Kitchen was very quiet. Miles was asleep in the nursery. She could hear traffic 43 floors below. She had come to Manhattan for a career. She'd met a man at a party. She'd married him. She had been living, without knowing it, on land that had been taken from her family. The coldness that moved through her then wasn't grief. It wasn't even anger. It was something more fundamental than either the deep, cellular recognition of a truth so enormous you can't process it all at once, only in pieces, only over time. She sat on the floor for another minute. Then she got up. "Keep going," she told Calder. "Don't stop." She had approximately 3 weeks before Ethan realized what was happening. She used every day of them. She copied documents. She organized files. She had Calder draft and filed the preliminary paperwork for a legal separation under New York statutes that would protect her access to Miles. She made 2 trips to a safe deposit box at a bank branch Ethan didn't know she used, depositing original copies of everything she'd collected, and she watched. She watched Ethan at dinner, pushing his food around his plate, distracted in the way he'd been distracted more and more often, not the distracted of a busy man, but the distracted of a man who was monitoring something, checking angles, running calculations. She watched him with Miles, who he held with the mechanical competence of someone who had read the correct instructions. Miles was 2 months old, already starting to track faces, already beginning to respond to the sound of voices. When Mara spoke to him, his whole face moved toward the sound of her. When Ethan spoke to him, the baby was polite about it. Babies knew things. She watched Ethan leave for work one Tuesday morning and wait until the elevator closed and then move faster than she'd moved in months, straight to his home office, where she'd already mapped the location of everything that mattered in the 90 days she'd been preparing. She found the folder by accident, or what felt like accident, though she'd been working her way toward it for weeks. It was in the back of his second desk drawer, behind a set of folders labeled with client names, tucked with the particular casualness of something he hadn't thought she'd find, because she wasn't supposed to be in this room. The label was in his handwriting, block capitals, the same controlled script he used for everything. Custody strategy. She stood for a moment with the folder in her hands. Then she opened it. He had been building a case against her for months, maybe longer. The documents inside were thorough. Notes from a private investigator she hadn't known was following her. The dates aligned with her visits to Calder, which he must have found suspicious even before he knew why. Screenshots of text messages pulled from a cloud backup she hadn't known he had access to. A psychological assessment template with her name at the top, characterizing her as emotionally reactive, financially irresponsible, prone to irrational decision-making under stress. The irresponsible part almost made her laugh. She had never once, in 3 years of marriage, had access to enough of their shared finances to be irresponsible with. The final document was a memo to a family law attorney she didn't recognize, outlining a strategy for demonstrating that Mara's nursing career made her unavailable for primary care, that her history of anxiety, one appointment with a therapist 2 years ago, apparently also surveilled, made her emotionally unsuitable, and that their son's best interests were served by Ethan having primary custody with Mara having limited visitation. She photographed every page. She put the folder back exactly as she'd found it. She walked to the nursery where Miles was awake and making the small exploratory sounds that meant he was ready to be picked up. She lifted him and held him against her chest and stood at the window for a long time, looking at the park below, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she was dealing with, not as a victim. Not as a woman who had been betrayed, but as someone who needed to understand the terrain completely before she moved. He wasn't going to fight for their marriage. He was going to fight for control, and she was going to have to be smarter than him. She went back to the kitchen. She made herself coffee. She fed Miles. She called Calder while the baby was in his swing and spoke quietly and specifically for 11 minutes. When Ethan came home that evening, she made dinner. She asked about his day. She listened to the answer. She laughed at the right moments. She was extraordinary at pretending to be fine. 3 years of practice. That night, after he was asleep, she sat in the nursery again. She had given herself 10-minute increments of honesty for months. Tonight she gave herself 20. She was terrified. That was the truth. Not of Ethan. Not exactly she didn't believe he was physically dangerous. But of the machinery he'd put in motion against her. Of the resources he had that she didn't. Of the brutal arithmetic of a custody battle against a wealthy man in a city where wealthy men had access to better lawyers and longer attention spans. She was also underneath the fear, completely certain. She was not leaving without her son. She was not leaving without what her family was owed. And she was not leaving without making absolutely sure that Ethan Vale understood precisely, and in terms he could not later reframe or deny, what he had done. She had one more thing to do before she left. She spent the next 4 nights assembling the flash drive. It contained everything: the affair documentation, the hotel receipts, the manipulated prenuptial terms, the custody strategy folder, the financial records showing her exclusion from assets, and at the very end of the file, in a folder she labeled with his last name, a copy of the Valcroft Holdings transaction records, the original Bennett Ranch deed, and the altered appraisal documents. She wrote the note by hand because she wanted him to know it was her. Not her attorney, not a process server, her. I'm taking back what you stole from me. You buried the truth for years. Now I'm taking it with me. She left the flash drive on the kitchen island. On a Thursday morning in late November, Ethan left for work at 7:45. She watched the elevator doors close from the living room. She dressed Miles in his warmest layers. She packed only what mattered: the documents, the medical records, a week of clothes for both of them, his medications, her nursing credentials, and the single-framed photograph of her grandfather she'd kept in the nursery because Ethan hadn't known it was there, and so hadn't bothered to have opinions about it. She left the penthouse at 8:14. She didn't run. She walked. She walked with her son on her chest and her grandfather's photograph in her bag, and the full weight of everything she knew pressing down on her, and the full force of everything she'd decided, holding her steady. The elevator opened on the lobby. The doorman, whose name was Gerald, and who had always been kind to her in the specific way of people who notice things and say nothing, looked at her face and then looked at the bag and held the door open without a word. "Thank you, Gerald," she said. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Vale," he said. She stepped out into the cold November air. She had somewhere to go. She had people waiting. And Ethan Vale, returning to his penthouse that evening with no reason yet to suspect anything except the small, persistent unease he'd been carrying for weeks, the sense of something shifting at the edges of his carefully controlled life, would find the kitchen island and the flash drive and the note in her handwriting. And he would begin to understand, for the first time, what it felt like to lose something he'd believed was permanently his. Ethan Vale was not a man who panicked. He had built his entire professional identity on the opposite of panic, on the particular composure that came from always knowing more than the person across the table from you, always having a contingency, always being 3 moves ahead of whatever was coming. His colleagues called it discipline. His rivals called it coldness. His father had called it survival. He found the flash drive at 6:47 in the evening. He'd come home in a reasonable mood. The markets had closed well. He'd had a productive call with a Tokyo firm about a joint venture that had been stalled for months and finally showed signs of movement. He'd stopped at the deli on 63rd for the good soup that Mara had started buying lately, because Miles had a slight cold and she'd read somewhere that the steam helped, and he had bought it without being asked because he was capable of that, of small gestures, of proving to himself that he was a man who did thoughtful things. He set the soup on the kitchen island and saw the note. He read it once. Then again. He picked up the flash drive and turned it over in his fingers. The apartment was quiet in a way apartments were not supposed to be quiet. Not the quiet of a baby sleeping down the hall. Not the quiet of a woman in the bath with the door closed. A different quality of silence. The silence of a space that had been emptied of something essential. The way a room feels after furniture has been removed. The air not yet adjusted to the new shape of things. He walked to the nursery. The bassinet was gone. The changing table was cleared. The small row of stuffed animals that had accumulated on the windowsill, the ones Mara's colleague at the hospital had given her, the ones he'd thought were excessive, gone. He opened the closet. Her clothes gone. Her shoes, her coat, the duffel bag she kept on the top shelf, gone. He stood in the middle of their bedroom for a long moment. Then he went back to the kitchen, sat down at the island, and plugged the flash drive into his laptop. He gave himself credit for that, for sitting, for not calling her in the first 30 seconds, for applying the same methodical approach to this that he applied to everything. He had always believed that the first response to an unexpected development was the most dangerous one. You did not act in the first 30 seconds. You gathered information. He gathered it. It took him 11 minutes to understand what he was looking at. The affair documentation he had expected, if he was honest. The hotel, the restaurant, the photographs. Vivian had insisted they not take, but he had taken anyway on his own phone, because he was arrogant enough to believe his phone was secure. He moved past those with the controlled discomfort of a man confronting something he'd already prepared a story for. The prenuptial documentation he looked at longer. Someone had gotten into the original files, not the copies, the originals, and annotated them with the precise legal language that Calder Shaw had apparently used to identify the specific provisions designed to eliminate Mara's property rights. He felt a slow, climbing unease reading that Shaw. He knew that name. Shaw had been in an accident 18 months ago, something on the West Side Highway. Ethan had a vague memory of Mara mentioning it, some patient she'd seen in the ER. He should have been more careful about her patients. The custody folder hit him differently. Not because it was incriminating he'd built it. He knew what was in it, and he still believed, with the certainty of a man who trusted his own conclusions, above almost everything else, that his legal strategy was sound. What hit him was the fact that she'd found it. He'd been careful. He was always careful. And she'd found it anyway, which meant she'd been moving through his space deliberately, methodically, for longer than he'd realized, and she'd been doing it without once showing her hand. He sat with that for a minute, reassessing. Then he opened the final folder. Balcroft Holdings. He closed the laptop. He sat in the kitchen for a long time after that, the soup cooling beside him, the apartment maintaining its terrible silence, and he did something he did almost never. He let himself feel the full shape of what was happening. She knew about the property. She had the original deed. She had the appraisal documents. She had enough. Calder Shaw would make sure she had enough to build a case that went well beyond infidelity or a contentious divorce. This wasn't a custody battle anymore. This was a reconstruction of his entire financial history. He picked up his phone. He called Vivian. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting. "She's gone," he said, a pause. "When?" "Today. This morning, probably." He stood up, moved to the window. The park was dark below, the paths lit with yellow light, a few runners moving in the cold. She left a flash drive, Ethan. Vivian's voice changed, not softer, more precise. What was on it? Everything. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Another pause, longer this time. He could hear her breathing, the particular rhythm of someone calculating. Property record, she asked? Yes. How it wasn't a question. It was the sound of a woman who'd known this was a possibility and hoped it wasn't, and was now recalibrating accordingly. I don't know yet, he said, but she has an attorney. Shaw, family litigation. I know who Shaw is. Then you know I need to move. You need to be careful, Vivian said, and there was something in her voice he hadn't heard before, not concern for him. He didn't make the mistake of thinking that, but a kind of warning that had self-interest threaded through it. If she's already filed preliminary papers, any aggressive move on your end becomes evidence of. I know what it becomes evidence of. Then don't ask me to tell you what you already know. He ended the call. He was on the phone with his attorney, Philip Rourke, at 7:15. Rourke was the best family law attorney in the city, which meant he was expensive, methodical, and completely unsentimental about human relationships, which were the three qualities Ethan required in a crisis. I need an emergency custody motion, Ethan said. On what grounds? She left with my son without notice. That's parental abduction. Careful pause. Ethan, if she has legal counsel who's already filed separation papers, which I'm going to guess is the case, she's covered. She's not abducted the child. She's left the marital home, which she's entitled to do. She didn't tell me where she was going. She's not required to, at this stage. Rourke's voice was patient in the way expensive men's voices were patient that you'd bought. What I need to know is whether there are grounds to request an emergency hearing. Is the child in danger? Of course not. Is she impaired? History of mental illness. Substance use. No. Has she violated any existing court order? There's no existing court order. Then I can't file emergency papers tonight, Ethan. What I can do is have separation and custody documents on the judge's desk when they open tomorrow morning. A pause. I need to know about the flash drive. Ethan was quiet. She referenced it when she called Shaw. Rourke said evenly, Yes, I know about Shaw. And I know what Shaw found in your financial structure, because a man in my position hears things. So I need you to tell me how serious the property issue is before I walk into that courtroom. Ethan pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. Serious, define serious. The foundation of my father's primary asset acquisition. The one that capitalized the family fund in the early 2000s. The silence on Rourke's end lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. Then you need a financial attorney as well. Tonight, if possible. I know. Ethan. Rourke's voice changed, stripped of the professional buffer. How much of what you have is built on that acquisition? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Rourke was smart enough to read the silence. All right, Rourke said. I'll have the custody papers filed by 8A. But understand, if she has what I think she has, the custody fight becomes secondary. This could be a fraud case. That's federal territory. I understand, Ethan said. He understood. He just didn't believe it had gotten that far yet. He still had room to move. He still had leverage. He always had leverage. He called his assistant at 7:40 and said he would not be in tomorrow morning and to clear his afternoon. He ordered food he didn't eat. He sat at his desk and worked through the Valcroft files as copies, the ones Mara hadn't taken, looking for every weakness, every alternative reading of the documents, every angle that could create enough ambiguity to slow a legal challenge down. He worked until 2 in the morning. He was very good at it. But there was something underneath the work, underneath the strategy and the phone calls and the methodical assessment of his position. Something he kept pushing to the edges of his attention, and that kept sliding back to the center. She had known about Vivian. She had known about the custody folder. She had found the Valcroft documents, which no one was supposed to be able to find. She had been in his home, in his space, for months longer, maybe moving through the architecture of everything he'd built, and she'd been utterly invisible to him. He had thought he was watching her. She had been watching him. The city was gray and exhausted looking when Mara woke up in Calder Shaw's guest room the following morning. Miles had slept in a borrowed travel crib that Calder's paralegal had dropped off the previous evening, along with a duffel of emergency supplies formula, diapers, a small mobile that played quiet sounds, because Calder ran a practice where people arrived in crisis regularly, and he had learned to prepare for the material reality of that. Mara had slept 4 hours. She had learned in emergency nursing to be functional on 4 hours. She didn't like it, but she could do it. She fed Miles in the gray morning light, sitting on the edge of the guest bed in a borrowed robe, listening to the sounds of the city outside, and the sound of her son eating, and the particular silence of a place where no one was managing her. The relief of it was almost physical. Calder was in the kitchen when she came out, 2 mugs already on the table, a legal pad covered in handwriting beside them. He was 43, lean and slightly rumpled in the way of men who worked long hours and had never fully prioritized the domestic version of themselves. And he looked up when she came in with Miles on her hip and said, he filed. She sat down. When? 8:03 this morning. Rourke. He said the name with the specific flatness of professional respect that contained zero personal warmth. Good. Which means we need to be better. He turned the legal pad toward her. Preliminary hearing is set for the 14th. That gives us 10 days. What's he claiming? Parental interference, which won't stick but buys him time. And emotional instability on your part. Calder said it evenly, the way he said things that were designed to make her react. The psychological assessment from 2 years ago. I saw a therapist 6 times after my mother died. I know. I've already requested the records. He took a drink of his coffee. Here's where we are. The custody argument, Rourke can make a compelling surface case. He'll point to your work schedule, your hours, the fact that you left the marital home without prior notice. None of it holds if we respond correctly. And the property case? He was quiet for a moment. That's the one that worries him. The custody argument is a smokescreen. It's designed to drain your attention and resources while he stabilizes his financial position. Mara looked at Miles, who was watching a fixed point on the wall with the focused intensity of babies, who had not yet learned to pretend they weren't paying attention to everything. So he's trying to overwhelm me. Yes. How many fronts can we hold? We're smart about it? Calder said. All of them. He leaned back. But I need something from you first. I need you to tell me everything about your grandfather's ranch that you know. Not what you were told. What you actually remember. She thought about it. I was there every summer until I was 17. It was substantial land. Cattle primarily, but the north parcel was leased for agricultural use. My grandfather kept meticulous records. He was almost obsessive about documentation. He didn't trust banks, didn't entirely trust lawyers, but he trusted paper. Did your mother ever show you the sale documents? She said there weren't documents. She said it was handled through my grandfather's estate attorney, and that by the time she understood what she'd signed, it was already recorded. Calder wrote something on the pad. What was the estate attorney's name? Still, she hadn't thought about this in years. The name surfaced from a very deep place, not memory exactly. More like the texture of a particular summer, sitting in her grandfather's kitchen while adults talked around her, in the way adults did when they thought children weren't absorbing anything. Renner, she said. Harlan Renner. He was based in Tucson. Calder wrote it down. Renner retired in 2014. He's still alive. 78, lives in Scottsdale. He looked up. I found him last week. Her breath changed. He agreed to speak with me, Calder said. He's been carrying something for a long time. He didn't know the Valcroft documents were altered. He was given the appraisal by Gerald Vale's representative and told it was standard. But he's been uncomfortable about it for 20 years. He could testify. If we get to that stage, yes. But right now he's a witness, and witnesses have to be protected. Calder closed the legal pad. Ethan doesn't know about Renner yet. That's our only real advantage. We need to use it before he figures it out. She nodded. Her hands were steady. She was good in emergencies. Oh, she said. What do I do today? Today, Calder said, we find you and Miles somewhere Ethan's PI can't locate in the next 48 hours. And you call Naomi Mercer, because I want a statement from her about what she observed at that hospital. Mara nodded. She looked down at Miles, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder with the abruptness of infants, one fist curled against her collarbone. She thought about her grandfather's handwriting in that ledger, the careful columns of numbers, everything documented, everything real. She thought about Ethan sitting in the kitchen with the soup he'd bought for her and finding the note she'd left him. She hoped the soup was cold. Naomi Mercer was not a woman who intimidated easily. She'd been in medicine for 31 years. She'd worked in under-resourced hospitals in 3 states before landing at Bellevue. She'd testified as an expert witness in 14 cases involving patient care, and she had been married twice, once badly, once well, and had arrived at 72 with the particular confidence of a woman who no longer had anything to prove to anyone, and therefore couldn't be bluffed. When Mara called at 9:15 that morning, Naomi answered with, I've been waiting. before Mara could explain why she was calling. "You've been watching the news," Mara said. "I've been watching my email. Caldershaw sent me a preliminary document request last night." A pause. "Are you safe?" "Yes, Miles is safe." "Good, tell me what you need," Mara told her. Naomi listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Mara had come to rely on, the particular respect of a listener who didn't feel the need to fill every pause with their own response. "I'll give a statement," Naomi said when she'd finished. "Whatever I observed at that hospital is documented in my own notes, which I kept because I had a feeling." She paused. "Mara, I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "Did you know, when you left, that this was going to become what it's becoming?" Mara thought about the question seriously. "I knew it would be bad. I didn't know about the property, not the full scope of it. Not Valcroft." She shifted Miles to her other shoulder. "I thought I was leaving a controlling husband, with a plan to protect my son. I didn't know I was leaving the person who'd been constructed from something taken from my family. Does it change what you're doing?" "No," Mara said. "Changes how I understand it." A long pause. "I'll have the statement to Calder by 5. "Thank you, Naomi." "Don't thank me," Naomi said. "I've been waiting 30 years to testify in a case that mattered. This is a gift." Ethan's second mistake, the first being Valcroft, the first being all of it, really, but the second being the one he made in real time, and therefore could have avoided, happened on the 4th day after Mara left. He'd been careful up until that point. He'd followed Rourke's instructions, stayed out of direct contact with Mara, worked through the proper channels. He'd been to the penthouse twice to check on things, and had stood in the nursery each time, looking at the empty space where the bassinet had been, and had felt something he couldn't name accurately, and didn't try to. But on the 4th day, he made a mistake. He sent Vivian to find out where Mara was staying. It seemed reasonable to him. Vivian had contacts throughout the city's professional network. She knew people who knew people. She moved in overlapping circles with half the medical community through her healthcare consulting work, and she was motivated. He needed to know where Mara was. That was simply intelligence gathering. What he hadn't considered carefully enough was that Vivian had her own calculus about this situation, had always had her own calculus, which he'd chosen not to examine too closely because it was useful not to, and that Vivian asking questions about Mara's whereabouts through their shared professional network would generate a footprint that Calder-Shaw would eventually see. Vivian made 3 calls. The third one was to a hospital administrator she knew socially, asking whether Mara Bennett Vale was currently on leave or had resigned her position. That administrator mentioned the inquiry to a colleague. That colleague mentioned it to Dr. Naomi Mercer in passing, over lunch, because the colleague thought it was odd that someone was asking about Mara's employment status. Naomi called Calder-Shaw before she finished her coffee. Calder called Mara at 2:47 in the afternoon with a voice that had gone carefully flat, the voice he used when something had changed. "Vivian Cross has been asking about you," he said, "through hospital connections. She's trying to locate you." Mara was at a grocery store, Miles in the carrier on her chest, and she stopped in the middle of the cereal aisle and stood very still. "He sent her," she said. "Almost certainly. Can you use that? It demonstrates ongoing coordination between them, which is useful." But Mara paused. "We need to talk about Vivian Cross. There's more." She moved to a quieter section of the store, near the back. "Tell me. She's not just a corporate strategist. She worked for Gerald Vale's firm for 3 years, starting 2 years before your grandfather's ranch was transferred. She was a junior analyst. She's known about Valcroft for a long time." The information settled into Mara with a horrible, specific clarity. Not just Ethan. Vivian had known. "She's been helping him manage it," Mara said. "That's what I think, yes." She stood in the quiet of the grocery store's back aisle, Miles asleep against her chest, completely still. "Is she liable?" she asked. "Potentially, if we can show she had knowledge and actively assisted in concealing it." A pause. "This broadens the case, Mara, significantly." "Okay. Okay like you understand, or okay like you've already thought about this?" "Both," she said. She bought her groceries. She drove back to the apartment. Calder had arranged for her for a sublet in Brooklyn from a colleague of his, paid 3 months in advance, registered under a name Ethan wouldn't connect to her. She put Miles down for a nap. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and thought about Vivian Cross for a long time. She thought about what it meant for a woman to know that something had been stolen from another woman's family and to stay quiet about it, stay involved, to make it worse. She didn't hate Vivian the way she expected to. What she felt was something colder and more useful than hate. She felt confirmed. This was bigger than a divorce. It had always been bigger than a divorce. Ethan had needed it to look like a marriage because marriages were controllable, because wives could be managed and their claims minimized, because a woman who believed she was simply an estranged spouse was much less dangerous than a woman who understood she was an heir pursuing a fraud case. He had married her to keep her quiet. He'd thought love or the performance of it was enough. She opened her laptop. She wrote to Calder, "I want Vivian Cross named in the civil filing. Whatever you need from me to make that happen, I'll do it." His response came in 4 minutes, already working on it. The hearing on the 14th was not the climactic confrontation that movies made custody proceedings appear to be. It was a conference room in the family court building, fluorescent lighting, a judge who had seen 1,000 variations of this particular story and had developed the specific patience of someone who was paid to be thorough before they were paid to be quick. Mara sat beside Calder in a charcoal blazer she'd bought 2 days earlier because she didn't have the right clothes with her. She'd packed for survival, not for courtrooms, and she kept her hands flat on the table and her face carefully arranged. Ethan was across the room with Rourke. She looked at him once when she came in. He looked at her. A long moment of eye contact that contained everything they'd been to each other and everything they'd been doing to each other for years. He looked tired. Not demolished. Not broken. Just tired, in the way of a man who'd been working hard to manage a situation that kept expanding past the edges of his management. She looked away first, but not because she needed to. She looked away because she was done with him as a study subject. She already knew everything she needed to know about Ethan Vale. Now he was just an obstacle. Rourke was good. He was smooth, organized, and careful in the specific way that told her. He knew his client's case had vulnerabilities. He argued the custody issue with the measured precision of a man playing a contained game. Mara had left without notification, had taken a newborn infant, had a work schedule that raised questions about primary availability. Calder responded with Naomi's statement, with Mara's nursing record and commendations, with the hospital's family leave documentation showing she was on approved leave, with the prenuptial addendum and its irregular provisions, which he introduced not as the primary argument but as context for why Mara had reason to secure her departure carefully. The judge, a woman in her 60s, who listened with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to hear what wasn't said, as well as what was, looked at both sides and said she was not granting emergency custody modification to either party and that they would proceed to a full evaluation. Rourke leaned toward Ethan and said something quiet. Ethan's jaw tightened. In the hallway afterward, while Calder was speaking with the court clerk, Ethan appeared at Mara's elbow. She heard him before she saw him, the particular cadence of his footsteps, which she had unconsciously memorized the way you memorize the sounds of your own home. Turned. He was close, not inappropriately so, just close enough for the conversation to be private. He looked at her in the way she'd always found most disarming about him, directly, without the social machinery that most people deployed, just straight eye contact with something almost honest in it. "Where is he?" Ethan said. "I want to see him talk to Rourke," Mara said. "Rourke can talk to Calder. That's how this works now. He's my son." "I know." She held his gaze. "He's also the grandson of a woman whose land your father stole. You don't get to separate those facts." Something moved across his face that might, in a different life, have been the beginning of something real. Acknowledgement, maybe. Or the edge of it. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful, controlled expression she knew better. "You don't know everything about what happened," he said. "I know enough," she said. "I have Harlan Renner." She watched his face change, then genuinely, involuntarily, the color leaving, and something close to fear arriving in its place, the first time she had ever seen Ethan Vale look afraid. She held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then she turned and walked back to where Calder was standing. Calder looked at her when she reached him. "What did you say to him?" "I told him about Renner." Calder was quiet for a moment. "Because he needed to know we have him," she said. "And because I wanted to see what his face did." "What did it do?" She picked up her bag. She thought about Ethan's face, the color draining out of it, the involuntary crack in the composure he'd spent 20 years building. "Told me everything I needed to know about how solid our case is," she said. Calder nodded slowly. They walked out of the courthouse together, into the cold December air, and Mara pulled her coat tighter and thought about Harlan Renner in Scottsdale, 78 years old, carrying a discomfort that had lived in him for 2 decades. She thought about her grandfather's handwriting in the ledger. She thought about Ethan's face. She thought about Miles, who was with Calder's paralegal this morning and who would be back in her arms in 2 hours, and she held that fact at the center of everything else, like a fixed point. Whatever came next, she knew one thing clearly. Ethan had believed that finding her name at the beginning of this story was enough. Knowing she existed, engineering a marriage around her, managing her carefully for 3 years, he had believed that was control. He hadn't understood that you could know someone's name and still completely fail to understand what they were capable of. He was beginning to understand it now. And in 4 days, when Calder filed the amended civil complaint, naming both Ethan Vale and Vivian Cross as defendants in a fraud and unjust enrichment action connected to the transfer of the Bennett Ranch property, when Ethan saw Vivian's name in the same document as his own, and understood what that meant. For his ability to control the narrative, there would be no path back to the version of this story where he won cleanly. There would only be the version where Mara had the evidence, and the attorney, and the witness, and the will. And she had spent 3 years, without knowing it, preparing for exactly this. The amended civil complaint landed on a Thursday. Calder filed it at 8:41 in the morning, and by 9:15, Rourke had a copy, and by 9:50, Ethan had called Vivian 4 times without an answer, and by 10:30, Vivian's attorney had contacted Calder's office to request a copy of the filing, which meant Vivian had her own attorney now, which meant she'd been expecting this, which meant she'd been preparing for the possibility of separation from Ethan's legal position for longer than Ethan had realized. Calder told Mara all of this over the phone while she was feeding Miles his morning bottle in the Brooklyn apartment, and she listened to each piece of information with the stillness she'd learned to maintain in emergency situations, not detachment, not coldness, but the deliberate suspension of reaction until you had the full picture. She's going to break from him, Mara said. That's my read, Calder said. Her attorney is David Fine. Fine doesn't do loyalty cases. He does exits. Miles finished the bottle and pulled away from it with the satisfied, slightly glazed expression of a well-fed 3-month-old, and Mara shifted him to her shoulder and began the slow circular motion on his back. What does that mean for us? It means Vivian Cross is about to become either our best witness or our biggest problem. And we won't know which until she decides what she's trading. Mara thought about that. She has more than what she told Ethan she has. Pause. What makes you say that? Because women like Vivian don't stay involved with men like Ethan out of affection, Mara said. They stay because they're holding something. She's been managing Valcroft's exposure. For years, she wouldn't do that without insurance. Calder was quiet for a moment. She could hear him writing. I'll reach out to Fine today. Do that, she said. And Calder find out when she started at Gerald Vale's firm, the exact date, and find out who assigned her to the Valcroft account. You think she was placed? I think nothing about this was accidental, Mara said, including her. She ended the call. Miles had fallen into the shallow, fluttering sleep of babies who weren't entirely convinced it was nap time, and she held him carefully and stood at the window of the Brooklyn apartment, looking at a narrow strip of gray December sky between 2 buildings. She was right about more than she knew. She just didn't know yet how much more. The call from Calder came 6 days later, at 11:20 at night. She was awake. She was almost always awake. At this hour, the particular insomnia of someone whose nervous system had been running at emergency pitch for weeks, sitting at the kitchen table with case documents spread in front of her, cross-referencing dates in the Valcroft transaction timeline against what she knew of Ethan's family history. She answered on the first ring. Calder's voice had a quality she hadn't heard before. Not the careful flatness of controlled bad news. Something rawer than that. Something that told her he was sitting somewhere alone, and had been sitting there for a while before he called. I need you to listen to everything before you respond, he said. She put down her pen. Okay, I spoke to Fiend today. Vivian Cross has agreed to a proffer she'll cooperate with our civil case in exchange for being dropped from the fraud count. A pause. She has documents, Mara, a significant amount of documents. Her own copies of the Valcroft files, correspondence between Gerald Vale and Harlan Renner, the original correspondence, before Renner understood what he'd been handed, and financial records showing the flow of money from the property transfer into the fund that became Ethan's inheritance. Good, Mara said carefully. That's what we need. Yes. Another pause longer. There's something else she has. Something I didn't find because I wasn't looking for it. She waited. Your mother didn't sell the ranch because she wanted to, Calder said. She sold it because she was told she had to. She was shown documents, fabricated ones, indicating that your grandfather had taken out a significant loan against the property in the last year of his life, and that the sale was required to satisfy the debt. The loan didn't exist. There was no debt. Harlan Renner was given the fabricated loan documents by Gerald Vale's representative and presented them to your mother as fact. Kitchen was very quiet. She thought she had no choice, Mara said. She thought she was saving the estate from foreclosure. Mara sat with that for a long moment. Her mother, Patricia, who had spent the last decade of her life in a small house in Tucson, who had apologized to Mara once, only once, for losing the ranch. I should have fought harder. I should have understood it better, who had died 3 years ago, believing she had failed her father. She hadn't failed anyone. She'd been deceived by a man with a briefcase and a friendly smile, and documents her attorney told her were real. Mara, Calder said. I'm here, there's more. She put her hand flat on the table. Tell me. Vivian's documents include correspondence from Gerald Vale to a private investigator, dating from approximately 9 years ago. He paused. The investigator was hired to locate Frank Bennett's surviving heirs and assess their financial position and vulnerability. She understood where this was going before he finished the sentence. He found you, she said. He found you. Compiled a report. Your nursing career, your salary. Your assets at that point, essentially nothing. You were 4 years out of school, with student debt, your family structure. The report was delivered to Gerald Vale in the spring. Another pause. Gerald Vale died 8 months later. But before he died, he gave the report to Ethan. The sound in Mara's ears was her own blood. How long before the fundraiser? She asked. Her voice was completely level. She was good in emergencies. She had always been good in emergencies. The fundraiser was 14 months after Gerald received the report, Calder said. Ethan had that file for over a year before he approached you. She pushed back from the table and stood up. She needed to stand up. Sitting felt like the wrong shape for what she was carrying. She walked to the window. The strip of sky between the buildings was black now, no light in it, and the street below was empty, except for a cab moving slowly through the slush. 14 months. He had known who she was for 14 months before he crossed a room at a fundraiser and looked at her in that particular direct way and asked her what the worst part of her job was. He hadn't seen her. He'd recognized her. He'd researched her. He'd assessed her. He'd determined that she was the optimal solution to the problem of Valcroft, that marrying Frank Bennett's granddaughter was a more elegant form of control than any legal maneuver, because a wife had limited rights. A wife could be managed. A wife who believed she was loved would never think to look at what was underneath the love. He married me to contain the liability, she said. Not a question. That's what the correspondence suggests his father recommended, yes. Calder's voice was very careful. Whether Ethan, don't, she said. He stopped. Don't tell me we can't know what Ethan felt, she said. I don't care what he felt. I care what he did. And what he did was spend 4 years. 4 years Calder making me feel like I was chosen. Making me feel like someone finally saw me clearly. Making me believe that the life I was living was something we'd built together. She pressed her hand against the cold glass of the window. He picked me out of a file. The silence on the line held everything Calder didn't say, which was the most honest response he could have given her. I know, he said finally. She stood at the window for a long time. Then she said, what do we do with this? The investigator's report and the correspondence become part of the fraud case. It establishes premeditation, that the marriage itself was an instrument of the fraud. That's significant, Mara. That changes the damages calculation substantially. A pause. It also may give you grounds for an annulment claim in addition to the divorce, depending on how the court interprets fraudulent inducement. I don't care about the annulment. I know. I'm telling you anyway because you should understand what you have. She turned away from the window. Miles was still asleep. She could hear the baby monitor, his small, steady breathing. She walked back to the table and stood over the documents she'd been cross-referencing. She'd been trying to understand the timeline. She'd been looking at Valcroft. She should have been looking at herself. I want to speak to Vivian, she said. Not for the case, not through attorneys. She picked up her pen, set it back down. I want to look at her and ask her one question. What question? She thought about Vivian Cross, whom she had never met, whose face she knew from photographs, intelligent, composed, the kind of beautiful that was also a kind of armor, who had known the full shape of this for years, who had watched Mara live inside it. Whether she ever felt anything about it, Mara said. Any of it. Calder was quiet, then I can ask fine. I can't promise anything. I know. She hung up. She stood in the kitchen of the borrowed Brooklyn apartment at 11:47 at night, and she gave herself the full truth of what she was feeling because she had learned that denying it only compressed it into something harder and less manageable. She felt obliterated. Not by Ethan's betrayal, she'd been building a wall against that for months, had suspected the shape of it, had constructed her exit around the expectation of it. She'd known on some level what kind of man he was. But this was different. This was the discovery that the version of herself who had stood at that fundraiser and felt for the first time in years like someone was genuinely paying attention, that woman hadn't been seen at all. She'd been identified, categorized, selected. The most intimate thing she thought she'd experienced had been a transaction. She allowed herself to feel that for 11 minutes. Then she folded it away, not neatly, not completely, but enough, and she picked up her pen and went back to the documents. Because she had Miles, and she had the case. And she was not going to let what Ethan had done to the woman she was then determine what happened to the woman she was now. Vivian Cross agreed to the meeting. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in Fine's conference room, which had the particular neutral sterility of spaces designed to facilitate difficult conversations without providing any comfort. Mara came with Calder. Vivian came with Fine. They sat across a table from each other for the first time. Mara had thought about this moment enough to know she didn't want to perform it. No controlled anger, no devastating one-liner, no cinematic confrontation. She just wanted to look at this woman and understand her. Vivian was 41 and looked like someone who had learned early that composure was a competitive advantage. She was well-dressed in the specific way of women who understood that appearance was information. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, and she was watching Mara with an expression that Mara couldn't immediately categorize, not guilt, not defiant, something more complicated than either. "You wanted to ask me something," Vivian said. Her voice was neutral, calibrated. "Yes," Mara said. She looked at Vivian Cross for a long moment. The woman who had known for years that Mara was living inside a fraud, who had continued her involvement with Ethan anyway, who had made 3 phone calls through hospital networks to locate Mara after she left. "Did you ever feel anything about it?" Mara asked. Vivian held her gaze. "About which part?" "Any of it. All of it." Mara kept her voice even. "You knew who I was before Ethan married me. You knew about the investigator's report. You were at Gerald Vale's firm when they put together the Valcroft transaction." She paused. "You watched him build a marriage around a woman he'd selected from a file. And you stayed. You helped him manage it. So I want to know, what does a person tell themselves to make that livable?" The room was very quiet. Fane made a small movement, a preparation to intervene, and Vivian stilled it with a brief gesture of her hand. She was looking at Mara with that complicated expression, and after a moment Mara understood what it was. It was recognition. "I told myself it was already done," Vivian said. "Property was already transferred. Your mother had already signed. You were already living well, better than you'd been, by most measures. I told myself that what Gerald started couldn't be undone, and that interfering would only create chaos that hurt people." She paused. "I was very good at believing that for a long time. And then you left?" Something shifted in Vivian's face. "And you left correctly. You didn't panic. You didn't blow it up. You didn't give him any warning. You planned it better than any exit I've seen, and I've seen a number of them in my career." She looked at her hands for a moment. "That was when I understood what I'd been telling myself was a story I needed, not a truth." Mara didn't respond immediately. She had come into this room expecting to feel anger at Vivian Cross. She had expected the clarity of a clean antagonist, someone she could hold fully accountable for a specific set of choices, someone whose face she could put on the worst parts of this. What she felt instead was something more complicated and less useful, a kind of grim comprehension of how people convince themselves to participate in other people's destruction through incremental compromise. Didn't excuse anything, but she understood it. "Everything you have," Mara said. "I need it all. Not just what Fane has negotiated. Everything." Vivian looked at her. "And if there's more than Fane has negotiated, then we renegotiate." Vivian turned to Fionn. Something passed between them, and she looked back at Mara. "There's one more thing," Vivian said. "Something I didn't include in the proffer, because I needed to understand how this was going to go first." Calder's posture shifted almost imperceptibly beside Mara. "Tell me," Mara said. Vivian placed her hands flat on the table. "Gerald Vale didn't only use Valcroft for your grandfather's property. There were 2 other transactions. Different families, different states, different shell companies, but the same mechanism fabricated debt. undervalued appraisal, fraudulent transfer. She paused. Ethan knew about all three. He inherited not just the fortune. He inherited the methodology. The air in the conference room changed. Mara heard Calder exhale slowly beside her. Other families, Mara said. Yes, with claims. Potentially, yes. If they knew where to look. Mara sat with this for a long moment. The shape of it was enormous. Much larger than a divorce, larger than the recovery of one ranch, larger than a single fraud case against a single financier. It was a pattern. And patterns, properly documented, properly filed, with the right federal attention patterns became precedents. Do you have documentation on the other transactions? She asked. Yes. All of it? All that I could access. Mara looked at Calder. He was very still beside her. The stillness of a man recalibrating the scale of what he was holding. We need to amend the filing again, Mara said. Yes, Calder said, and we need to make some calls. This is past civil litigation. Federal, if the interstate transactions hold up, yes. He paused. This is a significant escalation, Mara. What started as... I know what it started as, she said. I know exactly what it started as. She looked at Vivian. How long have you been holding this? Vivian held her gaze. Since Gerald died, 7 years. Why now? Vivian considered the question with the honesty of someone who had clearly also been considering it. Because you left correctly, she said again. And because I spent 7 years telling myself a story, and you leaving the way you left made it impossible to keep telling it. Mara looked at her for a long moment. There was nothing to say that was proportionate to 7 years of silence, and she knew it, and she didn't try. She turned to Calder. How long to amend the filing? 48 hours for the paperwork. But Mara, if we bring in the other transactions, we are moving this into territory where Ethan's exposure becomes... He stopped. Chose the word carefully. Catastrophic. This isn't a man losing a divorce settlement. This is a man facing federal fraud investigation. I know. And the response will be proportionate. He will come at you harder than anything we've seen so far. He will throw every resource, Calder. She looked at him. My grandfather built that ranch with 60 years of labor. My mother signed papers she didn't understand and spent the rest of her life believing she'd failed him. There are 2 other families somewhere who don't know yet what happened to them. She paused. What would you do? He held her gaze, then he picked up his pen. I'd amend the filing, he said. Then let's do that. They were in Calder's car, heading back across the bridge, when Calder's phone rang. He answered on the car's system, both hands on the wheel, and Mara heard the voice of his paralegal, a young woman named Rosa, who had the particular efficiency of someone who understood that her job was to filter information accurately and quickly. Rourke's office just filed something, Rosa said. Emergency motion. Calder's hands tightened on the wheel. What kind of motion? Petition to have the civil case consolidated with the custody proceeding. A pause. And they filed a complaint with the New York State Nursing Board. The car was quiet for a moment. Mara felt the specific cold of something she hadn't anticipated arriving without warning. On what grounds, she said. Alleged professional misconduct, Rosa said. They're claiming that you disclosed confidential patient information to obtain legal assistance. Specifically, a pause and Mara could hear Rosa reading carefully. That you disclosed information about a patient's identity and case to solicit pro bono legal services from that patient, constituting a violation of professional ethics and HIPAA. The bridge's suspension cables moved past the car windows. The patient was Calder. She had called Calder because she'd saved his life, and she had told him she needed help, and she had mentioned who she was and why she was calling, and she was completely certain. She had not disclosed anything about his medical case, or his treatment, or any protected information. But she had disclosed that he was her patient, and that was enough for a complaint. It won't hold, Calder said. His voice was controlled. You didn't disclose protected health information. It doesn't have to hold, Mara said. It has to distract. It has to create a record. It has to give the custody evaluation something to chew on. She pressed her hand against the cold car window. If there's a nursing board investigation, the custody evaluation will consider it. They won't wait for the outcome. They'll weigh it in the interim. Calder said nothing because she was right. She had spent weeks watching Ethan from across a courtroom, across a hallway, across the architecture of legal filings and counterfilings, and she had thought she understood his methodology. She had thought she had enough of a buffer, enough of a lead, enough of the right people around her. She had not anticipated him going after her license. Not because she hadn't thought he was capable of it. She was entirely clear about what he was capable of. But because it was the one thing she hadn't been able to protect against the one exposed edge in everything she'd built, her career was how she was going to support Miles. Her career was the only financial foundation that was entirely hers, that predated Ethan, that he had no claim on. If he damaged it, even temporarily, even with a complaint that was eventually dismissed, he destabilized everything. She took her hand off the window. She looked at the river below the bridge, moving dark and cold in the December afternoon. She had thought she was the one who'd been watching. She was right, she had been watching, but so had he. And he had found the one thing she'd left unguarded. "What do I do?" she said. It wasn't a question, she asked often. The shape of it felt strange in her mouth. Calder was quiet for a moment. "Then, you get ahead of it. Tonight, you call the head of nursing at Bellevue your supervisor, whoever you have the best relationship with, and you tell them before they hear it from the board. You give them your version first, and you document every detail of how you came to contact me. And the case? The case doesn't stop." He glanced at her. He wants you managing the nursing board complaint instead of managing the fraud case. Don't give him that. She nodded. Her hands were in her lap, completely still. She had come so far. She had built something real from nothing, piece by piece, in the dark, while holding a newborn and keeping her face arranged and performing normalcy for a man who was building a case to take her son. She had found Renner. She had found the other transactions. She had sat across from Vivian Cross and held herself together through the worst of it. And now her license, the thing she'd sacrificed years of sleep and student debt in the early years of her adulthood for, the thing that was entirely hers, that no prenuptial agreement and no manipulated document could touch, was sitting in the middle of Ethan Vale's next move. She breathed in, breathed out. "Okay," she said. She called her supervisor that evening. She documented everything. She wrote 12 pages of precise time-stamped notes about every interaction with Calder Shaw, from the moment she'd received his card to the moment she'd made the call, making absolutely clear, with the clinical specificity of a woman who had spent 2 years in a trauma unit and understood the importance of documentation, that she had not disclosed protected information. She did all of it with Miles on her lap, and she did it without crying, and she did it well. But that night, after Miles was asleep and the apartment was quiet, she sat on the bathroom floor with the door closed, not because she was breaking down, exactly, but because she needed 4 walls very close and the particular privacy of a small room, and she let herself understand what she was dealing with. She was not fighting a divorce anymore. She was fighting a man who had planned her from the beginning, who had resources she would never match, who had anticipated her moves and found her exposure, and filed a complaint designed to make her spend the next 6 months looking over her shoulder at her own career while he stabilized his position. She could keep going. She would keep going. But she needed to become something different than what she'd been, not harder. She was already hard enough, not colder. She could feel exactly the right amount, and still function. She'd learned that in emergency nursing, where you held a person's fear with one hand and kept the other hand steady on the instrument. She needed to become larger than the version of herself Ethan had assessed from that investigator's report 9 years ago. Larger than the woman he'd decided was manageable. Larger than the exit strategy he'd built his custody motion around. She sat on the bathroom floor for 22 minutes. Then she stood up, washed her face, and went back to the kitchen table. She had work to do, and the amended filing wasn't going to write itself. The nursing board complaint arrived officially on a Wednesday. Not the filing that had come through Calder's channels first, the way things always arrived to Mara a beat before they arrived officially. Because Calder had built a network of early warnings, and Mara had learned to live inside that buffer. The official notice came on a Wednesday morning in a standard envelope with a state seal in the upper left corner, and Mara stood in the kitchen of the Brooklyn apartment and read it with Miles in the bouncy chair at her feet, making the exploratory sounds of a baby who had recently discovered his own hands. The complaint alleged that Mara Bennett Vale RN had disclosed the identity and case status of a former patient to solicit legal representation, constituting violations of professional conduct standards and federal privacy regulations. She was required to respond in writing within 30 days and to appear before the board for a preliminary review in 6 weeks. She set the letter down on the table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called her nursing supervisor, Linda Cho, who had already been briefed but needed to hear Mara's voice and confirm she was handling it. "I'm handling it," Mara said. "I know you are," Linda said. "I've known you for 4 years, Mara. I know what kind of nurse you are, but I need you to understand while this is pending, I can't put you on the schedule. You're on administrative leave." The word landed with a specific weight. "I understand," Mara said. "It's not a judgment, I know. I understand, Linda." She ended the call. Administrative leave. No income. The sublet had 3 months covered by Calder's arrangement, but 3 months moved fast. She had savings, not much, not what she'd have had if her name had been on any of the accounts she'd contributed to for 3 years, but enough for a runway if she was careful. She looked at Miles, who had grabbed one of his own feet and was examining it with intense scientific focus. She had 6 weeks before the board review. She had the amended civil filing, which Calder had completed 2 days earlier, and which now named Ethan Vale and Vivian Cross in a fraud and unjust enrichment action, spanning 3 states and potentially drawing federal jurisdiction. She had Harlan Renner in Scottsdale, who had agreed to give a deposition in January. She had Vivian's documents, which were being processed by a forensic accountant Calder had retained. She also had a nursing board complaint, no active income, a custody evaluation scheduled for mid-January, and a man with unlimited resources who had just demonstrated he was willing to go after her license. She picked up her pen. She started writing her response to the board. She wrote for 4 hours, and it was the most precise document she had ever produced, more precise than any nursing note, any incident report, any care plan. She went through every interaction with Calder Shaw, from the emergency intake in September of the prior year to the card, to the call, with timestamps and specific details, and the exact words she'd used and had not used. She had not said, "Calder Shaw was in my emergency department on September 14th with internal hemorrhaging from a vehicle accident on the West Side Highway." She had said, "I treated a patient once who gave me a card. I'm calling because I need legal help." She had not disclosed protected information. She could prove it. The board review would confirm it. She was certain. But certain didn't mean fast, and fast was what she needed, and Ethan knew that. He wasn't trying to destroy her license. He was trying to use 6 weeks of her attention. She finished the document. She sent it to Calder for review. She made Miles his afternoon bottle and sat on the floor with him and let him grab her finger and hold it, with the full, irrational strength of a 4-month-old who didn't know anything about nursing boards or fraud cases, or the particular exhaustion of fighting a war on 4 fronts simultaneously. He held her finger and looked at her face with absolute trust. She held it together. The deposition of Harlan Renner took place on a Thursday in the first week of January, via video link from a conference room in Scottsdale that Renner's local attorney had arranged. Mara watched it from Calder's office, sitting in a chair in the corner where the camera couldn't see her, because she was not a party to this particular session, and because she had asked Calder if she could be present, and he'd said yes, without asking why, which she appreciated. Renner was 78, and looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and had recently put it down, but still felt the shape of it in his muscles. He was thin, white-haired, with the careful diction of someone who had spent 40 years choosing words professionally and had not lost the habit. Calder walked him through the transaction methodically. The documents he'd been given, the appraisal, the loan paperwork. "Did you verify the loan independently?" Calder asked. "I was told the documents were certified," Renner said. "I had no reason I believed. I had no reason to doubt the appraisal." A pause. He pressed his lips together. "I have thought about that a great deal, over many years, whether I should have verified more carefully, whether I allowed myself to not look too hard, because Gerald Vale was a significant client, and significant clients have a way of making a person not look too hard. And Patricia Bennett? What did she understand about the transaction? She understood she had inherited debt she couldn't service, and that the sale was the only way to protect what remained of the estate." Renner's voice was very careful. She was devastated. She kept saying her father had never mentioned a loan. "I told her that elderly people sometimes that it wasn't uncommon for—" He stopped. Jaw worked. "I told her things that I believed were true. I was wrong to believe them." Mara sat in the corner of Calder's office and looked at this old man on the screen, accounting for a mistake he'd made 20 years ago, and she felt something that wasn't anger, wasn't grief. It was more like the complicated texture of watching a person be honest after a long dishonesty, which was never clean, never satisfying, never as simple as the anger you'd carried toward them. Still necessary. It was still true. The deposition took 2 hours. When it ended and the screen went dark, Calder turned to her. "That's our foundation," he said. "How long until we can use it? Part of the civil filing already. But the federal referral," he paused. The U.S. Attorney's Office has been looking at the other two transactions. They reached out yesterday. She looked at him. And? They want to talk to Vivian. Has she agreed? She's been expecting the call. He set down his pen. Mara, when the federal interest becomes public, Ethan's financial position collapses. Not eventually. Immediately. His institutional investors will not wait for a conviction. The moment this becomes a federal fraud investigation, the money moves. She understood what he was saying. The collapse of his financial position affected the custody calculation. A man without resources was a different proposition than a man with them. Rourke became expensive differently. The architecture of his strategy shifted. When does it become public, she asked. The referral itself isn't public. Federal subpoenas are hard to keep quiet. He looked at her directly. My estimate is 3 to 4 weeks. 3 to 4 weeks. She thought about Miles, who was with Calder's paralegal again today and who had started in the past week, making a sound that was close enough to a laugh that it made her chest ache in a way she couldn't fully explain. 3 to 4 weeks. Okay, she said. What do I need to do between now and then? Survive the custody evaluation, he said. That's the priority. The custody evaluation was conducted by a Dr. Susan Farrell, a forensic psychologist who operated with the specific, deliberate neutrality of someone whose professional reputation depended on not appearing to favor either party, and who had enough experience in contentious custody cases to be deeply difficult to read. She met with Mara 3 times over 2 weeks. She met with Ethan. She reviewed the submitted documentation from both sides, which was substantial. She conducted a home observation visit to the Brooklyn apartment, arriving on a Tuesday morning with a colleague, and spending 90 minutes watching Mara interact with Miles in the natural environment of their living space. Mara had not staged anything for the visit. She had thought about it, had thought about whether to buy a different rug, or move the books, or arrange things in a way that read more favorably, and had decided not to, because the person who staged her home for a custody evaluator was a different person than the person she'd been trying to build toward. Was just home with her son. She fed him. She talked to him in the low, consistent way she'd always talked to him, narrating things, explaining things. The habit of a nurse who understood the importance of consistent verbal stimulus in early development. She put him on his mat and let him push against the floor with his feet. She changed him when he needed it without performing the competence of it. Dr. Farrell took notes. Her colleague observed. Mara made tea and offered it and went back to Miles. The visit lasted 90 minutes. As Dr. Farrell was leaving, she paused at the door and said, "He's a well-cared-for child, Miss Vale." Mara said Bennett. "I've gone back to Bennett." Dr. Farrell looked at her for a moment, made a small note, nodded, left. Ethan's evaluation session, she heard through Calder's network, had gone less smoothly. He'd arrived with Rourke's preparation visible in every answer, too careful, too calibrated. The kind of responses that read as coached to someone who spent their professional life listening for the difference between authentic and performed. Dr. Farrell had asked him to describe a typical morning with Miles before Mara left. He had described a morning in which he organized the day's schedule and confirmed with the nanny while Mara handled the feeding. He had not mentioned holding his son. She heard this and felt no satisfaction. Just a tired, accurate confirmation. The hearing came on a Friday morning in the second week of January. By then, the federal subpoenas had been served. Calder had been right about 3 to 4 weeks. It was 19 days from their conversation in his office. The subpoenas went to Ethan's firm, to 2 of his institutional partners, and to the registered agent of Valcroft Holdings, which had been dissolved 8 years ago, but whose records were still accessible in the Delaware Corporate Registry. The Wall Street Journal ran a 4-paragraph item on Thursday afternoon. Vale Capital under federal scrutiny in multi-state property fraud investigation. By Thursday evening, it had been picked up by 12 financial news outlets. By Friday morning, when Mara arrived at the family court building with Calder, it had been 48 hours since Ethan's primary institutional partner had formally withdrawn from their joint venture. She saw him in the hallway before the hearing. He looked like a man who had not slept in 2 days, which was accurate. He was still dressed well. Ethan Vale would dress well at his own demolition. She knew that about him, but the clothes were doing more work than usual, carrying a presentation that the body underneath had partially abandoned. His face was thinner, his jaw was tight, in a way that wasn't controlled tension anymore. But something past that. Something running on its own momentum. Rourke was beside him, speaking in a low voice, and Ethan was listening, but not entirely. She could see the part of him that was somewhere else, running numbers, recalculating. doing the thing he'd always done, which was work the problem rather than feel the problem. She walked past him toward the courtroom. He said her name. Not Mara, not Mrs. Vale, just Bennett. She stopped. Turned. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face in 4 years of marriage. Not the controlled directness she knew. Not the managed warmth he'd deployed in better years. Something stripped of all of it. Something that might have been real in a different context, and might have been another calculation, and she was no longer certain. She could tell the difference, and wasn't sure it mattered. "I need 5 minutes," he said. "No," she said, Mara. Bennett. She held his gaze, and no. She went into the courtroom. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Rourke was competent and precise, and fought for every inch of ground with the professionalism of a man who'd been retained through a significant retainer that was probably still clearing. He presented the custody argument. He raised the nursing board complaint, still pending, still unresolved, as a factor in assessing professional stability. He submitted character statements from 3 of Ethan's colleagues and 1 from a neighbor who had known them both during the marriage. Calder responded with Naomi's statement, with the 12 pages of Mara's documented nursing history and commendations. The home evaluation report from Dr. Farrell, who had submitted her preliminary findings that morning, and whose language, while measured, conveyed a clear picture of a child who was securely attached, well cared for, and thriving in his current environment. He submitted the deposition of Harlan Renner. Not as a custody document, it had limited direct relevance there, but as context for the financial fraud case, which was now formally referenced in the family proceedings, because Ethan's financial position was materially relevant to the custody and support calculations. And he submitted a statement from the U.S. Attorney's Office confirming that Mara Bennett was a cooperating witness and victim in an ongoing federal investigation, not a subject of it. The nursing board complaint was addressed in 2 paragraphs. Rourke objected to the framing. The judge considered. Sustained 1 objection, overruled 2. Ethan sat through all of it. She watched him, occasionally in the peripheral way she'd learned to watch things she needed to monitor, without appearing to monitor. He was still, almost entirely still, the kind of stillness that wasn't composure anymore but exhaustion. There was one moment when Calder read a section of Renner's deposition into the record, the part where Renner described Patricia Bennett's response to being told she had to sell. She kept saying her father never mentioned any loan. She kept saying it didn't sound right when something moved across Ethan's face. She couldn't name it. She wasn't going to try. The judge did not issue a final custody ruling that day. Family courts rarely did on the first hearing, where the full record was available. What she issued was a temporary order. Mara retained primary physical custody. Ethan was granted supervised visitation, 2 hours twice per week at a designated family services location, until the full evaluation was complete and the criminal investigation was either resolved or formally separated from the custody proceedings. Supervised visitation. She heard Rourke's exhale from across the room. She heard nothing from Ethan. Outside the courthouse, in the cold January air, she stood on the steps with Calder and let the cold reach her and fill her lungs, and she breathed it in and out 3 times without speaking. Supervised visitation, Calder said. Yes, the final ruling won't come until the federal case resolves further. Could be months. I know. Are you okay? She considered the question genuinely. The January wind was sharp and direct, and the city was moving around them. Cabs and pedestrians, and the low persistent noise of a place that did not pause for individual courtrooms or individual verdicts, or the particular weight of a woman standing on courthouse steps recalculating her life. I need to see Miles, she said. The car's ready. They walked down the steps. She was at the bottom when she heard Ethan's voice behind her, not calling her name this time. Just, how long are you going to do this? Turned. He was on the steps above her, Rourke gone, just Ethan in his good coat, that was doing its best for him in the cold. The distance between them was 6 steps and 4 years, and the entirety of her family's history. Do what, she said. Make this into a war. She looked at him for a long moment. I didn't make it anything, she said. You built it. I'm just the person who finally looked at what you built. She turned away. My father, he started. She stopped. Did not turn around. My father made choices I couldn't undo, Ethan said. I was 23 when I found out what he'd done. I was 23 and I had nothing except what he'd left, and undoing it would have meant, I know what it would have meant, she said, still not turning. It would have meant telling the truth. She heard him breathe. I'm sorry, he said. She stood on the bottom courthouse step for 3 seconds. The wind moved through the gap between buildings. A cab went past. Then she walked to the car. She did not accept or reject the apology. She did not respond to it at all, because the apology, whether it was real or another calculation, was not the thing that mattered, and she had learned in 4 years of emergency nursing, and 3 years of marriage, and 6 months of fighting for her life, that some things arrived too late to be addressed, and had to simply be recorded and moved past. She got in the car. She went to get her son. Miles was awake and bright-eyed when she arrived, recently fed, propped against Calder's paralegal Rose's knee, examining a plastic ring with the focused intensity of a scholar encountering a primary text. He heard Mara's voice before he saw her, and his whole body moved a full system response, arms pulling in, head turning, the biological fact of recognition. And when she came into his line of sight, his face opened up with the thing that was close to a smile, and getting closer every day. Picked him up, held him. She stood in the middle of Rose's apartment and held her son and felt the specific weight of him, the specific heat of him, the particular smell of his hair, and she allowed herself 30 seconds of not being strategic, not being precise, not being anything except a woman holding her child. 30 seconds. Then Rosa said quietly, "Calder's on the phone." She shifted Miles to one arm and took the phone. "The U.S. Attorney's Office wants to meet," Calder said. "Next Tuesday. They want Vivian's documents and your testimony about Valcroft. Full picture." A pause. "Mara, this is the federal level now. If you walk into that meeting, I know what it means. It means you're committing fully. It means the civil case, the custody case, the nursing board, all of it runs alongside a federal prosecution. Going to be Calder." She looked at Miles, who was examining her face with the same focused intensity he brought to everything. "Tell me one thing. What?" Is the case solid? A pause. She could hear him making the decision to be honest rather than careful. "Yes," he said, "it's solid." "Then Tuesday," she said. She handed the phone back to Rosa. She looked at Miles. She had come so far from the woman who'd stood in a hospital room, watching a man check his watch while their newborn son breathed too fast in an incubator. So far from the woman who'd sat in a nursery at midnight, giving herself 10-minute increments of honesty. So far from the woman Ethan had selected from an investigator's file and decided was manageable. That woman had been real. She had been her. She was not apologizing for her. But she was not that woman anymore. Miles grabbed the collar of her coat and held it with both hands and looked at her with the absolute, uncomplicated certainty of someone who had never once doubted she would show up. She was going to show up. She was going to walk into a federal building on Tuesday morning, and she was going to sit across from people who had the authority to end what Ethan Vale had been building for 20 years. And she was going to tell them everything she knew, clearly and completely, and without flinching. And she was going to do it because 3 families had lost something real, and someone had to be the person who said so in a room where it counted. She was going to do it because her grandfather had kept meticulous records in a leather ledger and trusted that paper meant something. She was going to do it because her mother had spent her last years believing she had failed. She was going to do it because Miles was holding her collar with both hands and looking at her like she was the fixed point in his entire universe, and she intended to be worthy of that. She pressed her cheek against the top of his head. Outside, January moved through the city, cold and indifferent, and full of the noise of people going about their lives. Inside, Mara Bennett held her son and breathed steadily, and felt the full weight of what Tuesday meant. She was ready. She had been ready for longer than she'd known. The federal building on Tuesday morning smelled like recycled air and old carpet and the particular institutional neutrality of places where consequential things happened without ceremony. Mara arrived 7 minutes early. She wore the charcoal blazer again. She'd bought a second one, same cut, because it was the right thing to wear, and she wasn't going to spend mental energy on that decision twice. She carried a leather folder Calder had given her that contained her organized documentation, timeline, cross-reference dates, her 12-page nursing board response as supplemental character context, and a single printed photograph of her grandfather's ranch taken in 1987 that she'd found in a box of her mother's things, and which she'd included not for evidentiary purposes, but because she needed to remember what this was actually about when the room got abstract. Calder was beside her. Vivian was in a separate room down the hall with Fine, which was the arrangement they would be interviewed separately. Their accounts cross-referenced, the documents submitted in parallel. The assistant U.S. attorney was a woman named Patricia Okafor, 40-something, compact and precise, with the manner of someone who had spent 15 years watching People decide in real time how honest they were going to be and had developed a finely calibrated impatience for the ones who chose wrong. She looked at Mara across the conference table and said, "Tell me everything, Ms. Bennett. Start before the marriage." Mara started before the marriage. She talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She was precise. She was thorough. She referred to her folder when she needed dates, but mostly she spoke from memory, because she had been living inside this story for 4 years, and it was organized in her body. As well as her mind, she could feel the specific weight of each discovery, each document, each moment of understanding that had reoriented everything. Okafor asked sharp questions. Not hostile, not skeptical exactly, but the questions of someone pressure testing a structure to find where it might give. Structure didn't give. Mara answered everything. When she got to the investigator's report, to the fact that Ethan had been given a file on her 14 months before he crossed a room at a fundraiser and looked at her like she was someone worth seeing, she felt Okafor's tension shift, sharpening without changing expression. "You're saying the marriage itself was an instrument of the fraud," Okafor said. "Yes," Mara said. "That's what I'm saying. That's a significant claim. I have the correspondence." Okafor looked at the documents Calder had submitted. She read. She made a note. She looked back at Mara. "How are you?" Mara blinked. It was not a question she'd expected in this room. "I'm functional." "That's not what I asked." She looked at this woman across the table, this precise and efficient stranger who had just spent 2 hours examining the architecture of the worst 4 years of her life. And she said what was true. "I'm angry. I'm tired. I have a 4-month-old at home." A pause. "I'm doing this because it's right. That's enough to keep going on." Okafor nodded once. "Back to business. The other 2 transactions. Vivian has those documents. We've received them. We're verifying." She closed the folder. "Ms. Bennett, I want to be direct with you. This investigation will take time. Potentially significant time. Federal fraud prosecution is not fast. You're going to be living alongside this for months, possibly longer. I know. Your custody case will proceed in parallel. The federal investigation doesn't pause that clock. I know that too. And Ethan Vale will continue to have access to resources that you don't." She said it plainly, not cruelly. "His firm is under scrutiny, but not frozen. He'll continue to fight." "I know," Mara said, for the 3rd time, and something in her voice made Okafor look at her with a slightly different expression, not warmth exactly. But the specific recognition one precise person gave another. "All right," Okafor said. "Then we proceed." The nursing board cleared her in March. It was not dramatic. There was no exoneration hearing, no moment of formal vindication with observers and statements. There was a letter received on a Tuesday, a different Tuesday, 10 weeks after the first envelope with the state seal that stated in formal, measured language that the complaint had been reviewed, that no violation of professional conduct standards had been found, and that the matter was considered closed. Mara read it at the kitchen table in the Brooklyn apartment, Miles in his high chair beside her, working systematically through a pile of soft banana pieces, with the focused determination of a child who had recently discovered he could feed himself and intended to exercise this ability as often as possible. She read the letter twice, folded it, put it in the folder where she kept the documents that mattered. She called Linda Cho. "You're back on the schedule whenever you're ready," Linda said. "I mean that, whenever." "I need a few more weeks," Mara said. "The federal process is still Mara." Linda's voice was patient and direct. "You take the time you need. Your job is here." She ended the call. She looked at Miles, who had a piece of banana on his forehead and was unaware of this and unbothered. She removed it. He grabbed her finger. "Standard procedure," she said to him. "Okay." The civil trial reframed now as a companion proceeding to the federal investigation, rather than its own primary action, began in April. By then, the institutional collapse Calder had predicted had happened, in the specific, unglamorous way that financial collapses actually happened. Not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of quiet withdrawals, redirected calls, partners who stopped returning emails, a slow draining of the infrastructure that had made Ethan Vale's name mean something in certain rooms. Vale Capital still existed on paper. It was operating at a fraction of its former scale. 2 of his 3 senior partners had departed. The Tokyo joint venture had dissolved in January, citing the federal scrutiny in language that was careful and absolute. Rourke was still his attorney. Rourke was very good and very expensive, and Mara knew from Calder that Ethan was liquidating personal assets to keep paying him, which meant the resources were finite in a way they had never been before. She did not feel satisfaction about this. She felt something more complicated, the uncomfortable recognition that watching someone's life dismantle was not clean, regardless of what they'd done, that destruction was destruction even when it was warranted, and that the only honest response to it was to keep her own purpose clear, so she wasn't doing this for the wrong reasons. She was doing this for 3 families. She was doing this for her grandfather's ledger. She was doing this for Miles, not for revenge, not to watch Ethan Vale diminish. Those were byproducts, and she was allowed to have complicated feelings about byproducts, but she could not let them become the engine. She kept showing up. The civil courtroom was different from family court, larger, more formal, the particular gravity of a proceeding that had financial documentation running to thousands of pages and 3 forensic accountants on retainer. Mara sat beside Calder, and she was steady and she was present, and she answered every question she was asked with the precision of a woman who had been preparing for this, in one form or another, for 4 years. Harlan Renner testified in person. He had flown from Scottsdale at 78 years old, which Mara had not expected, and which moved her in a way she hadn't prepared for this old man in a good suit, carrying his 20-year discomfort into a courtroom and setting it down in front of a judge. He described the documents he'd been given. He described Patricia Bennett's face when he told her about the loan. He was asked by Rourke on cross-examination whether he'd had any reason to doubt the document's authenticity at the time. He was quiet for a long moment. "I had a feeling," he said finally. "I had a feeling that wasn't quite right, and I didn't follow it." Rourke tried to use the admission of a feeling, unverified, unactionable. Calder redirected with the forensic accountant's analysis of the fabricated loan documents, which showed alterations that a more careful review would have revealed. The feeling was human. The fabrication was fact. Vivian Cross testified on the second day. She had spent 3 months negotiating her cooperation and the terms of it, and she walked to the stand with the composure of a woman who had decided what she was going to say and intended to say it clearly. She wore a dark green dress and no jewelry, and she looked, Mara thought, like a person who had recently put something down. She described her time at Gerald Vale's firm. She described the Valcroft mechanism, the shell company, the fabricated debt, the altered appraisals. She described being assigned to manage the paper trail when she was 26 and ambitious, and had not yet developed the part of herself that asked the questions she should have been asking. "Did you know it was fraud?" Rourke asked on cross. "Not at the beginning," Vivian said. "By the end, yes. And you continued to participate?" "Yes." "Why?" Vivian held Rourke's gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Because I told myself a story about why it was already done and couldn't be undone. And I believed it for a long time because it was convenient to believe it." Courtroom was quiet. Mara looked at her hands in her lap. On the 3rd day, Ethan took the stand. She had wondered how he would do it, whether he would perform contrition, perform ignorance, perform the version of himself that was most sympathetic. She had wondered if she would recognize the calculation under whatever presentation he chose. He sat in the witness chair, and he looked across the courtroom and found her face. She held his gaze. He looked tired in the deep way, not the surface tiredness of missed sleep, but the bone-level exhaustion of someone who had been holding a structure together through force of will and had reached the point where the will was running out. He answered Calder's questions carefully. He acknowledged inheriting Gerald Vale's financial records. He acknowledged knowing about Valcroft. He was precise about what he claimed to have known, and when, which was the strategy, acknowledge the inheritance, contest the intent, create distance between Gerald's choices and his own. Calder let him build it, let him construct the version where Ethan Vale was a young man handed a poisoned inheritance, and making the best of an impossible situation. Then Calder introduced the investigator's report. He read the commission date into the record. He established that Gerald Vale had been incapacitated by illness for the last 8 months of his life and had limited capacity for complex decision-making. He introduced the correspondence showing that Ethan, not Gerald, had directed the investigator's final report and authorized payment. Ethan had hired the investigator himself. Ethan had built the file on Mara himself. The distance between Gerald's choices and his own collapsed in 4 documents. Rourke objected to the framing, was overruled. Ethan sat in the witness chair and did not look across the courtroom. He looked at his hands. Mara watched him look at his hands. She watched the specific moment when the structure he'd been maintaining through 4 months of legal proceedings, and before that through 4 years of marriage, and before that through the entirety of his adult life, she watched it stop holding. Not dramatically. It didn't collapse. It just stopped holding, the way things did when the last structural element gave not with noise, just with a settling, a becoming something different. He was still Ethan Vale. He was still the man in the good coat on the courthouse steps. He was still precise and controlled and capable of enormous damage. He did not transform into a different person in that courtroom. Something stopped holding. The judge issued the civil verdict 3 weeks later. Mara was at work when Calder called. She'd gone back to Bellevue in March, negotiating a schedule that overlapped with Miles's time. With the newly confirmed primary caregiver arrangement, 4 days a week, the emergency department she'd worked in for 6 years, the familiar smell of antiseptic and effort, and she stepped into a supply closet to take the call. Judgment for the plaintiff on all counts, Calder said. Fraud, unjust enrichment, fraudulent inducement of marriage. A pause. Restitution calculated at the current assessed value of the Bennett property, plus 20 years of appreciation, plus legal costs. Another pause. Mara, it's significant. It's a significant number. She stood in the supply closet among the neat rows of gauze and saline and tape and breathed. The other families? She said. The federal case is handling those. They're further along than I expected. Okafor moves fast. The other 2 transactions are fully documented. The affected families have been notified. A pause. They know who you are. They know what you did. She didn't know what to say about that. She stayed quiet. The nursing board letter and the civil verdict. Together, the family court will finalize the custody order next month. Mara. Dr. Farrell's final report is unambiguous. Primary custody, standard visitation, no supervision requirement after 90 days, assuming the federal case remains a civil matter for Ethan and doesn't convert to criminal charges against him personally. Will it? The U.S. attorney is still evaluating. It depends on what Okafor decides about the intent evidence. A pause. My read is that it probably doesn't convert to personal criminal charges. The fraud is more cleanly pinned to Gerald Vale's original execution, and Ethan's participation, while significant, has enough distance from the primary crime to complicate prosecution. She understood. The law moved the way it moved. It was not the same as justice, and it was not the opposite of it. It was a mechanism, and mechanisms had tolerances and limits, and you used them for what they could do. Okay, she said. Okay, thank you, Calder. A pause. You don't have to thank me, I know. I want to. She put her phone in her pocket and went back to work. She worked 2 more hours. She had a patient, a woman in her 60s, came in with chest tightness that turned out to be anxiety, presenting as cardiac, which was not uncommon, and which Mara handled with the specific combination of clinical efficiency and genuine presence. That was the thing she was actually good at. The thing that had nothing to do with Ethan Vale or Valcroft or any of it, just a woman in a curtained bay who was scared, and Mara sitting beside her until the scared became manageable. The woman said, "You're very calm." Mara said, "It's a good day." The Arizona trip happened in June. She drove, which she hadn't expected to want to do. She'd assumed she would fly, assumed she'd want speed. But when the time came, she loaded Miles into the car seat and drove west on a Tuesday morning with the windows down and the radio low and the specific luxury of no particular schedule. Miles was 8 months old. He spent the drive alternating between intense observation of passing landscape and the deep instant sleep of babies who process the world so completely when awake that unconsciousness arrived suddenly and completely when it came. He woke up somewhere in New Mexico and looked out the window at the flat red distance and said "daw," which was not a word yet, but was close enough to one that Mara said yes, that out loud to no one. The Bennett property was different than she remembered, different than her memory of it, which she understood was her 7-year-old self's memory, which meant the scale was wrong, the house smaller, the land larger, the space between the barn and the fence line both shorter and more significant than she'd held it in her mind for 20 years. It had been used for cattle grazing by a series of tenants after the Valcroft transfer, and the primary structures were still standing, maintained at the functional minimum. Civil restitution had not transferred the land back directly. That would have required a separate quieting of title process that was still moving through the Arizona courts, but it had provided the financial equivalent of what the land was worth, and Calder had filed the title action in parallel. She was standing on the property as the heir of record while the legal mechanism caught up. She walked the fence line on the first morning, Miles on her hip, both of them in the early June heat that was already significant at 7 and would be serious by noon. The land smelled like dry grass and something mineral underneath, the specific smell of this particular piece of Arizona that she had not known she'd stored in her body until it arrived in her nostrils, and something in her chest loosened. She walked the whole fence line. It took an hour. Miles fell asleep against her shoulder halfway around and stayed asleep for the back half. His weight settled into her with the unself-conscious completeness of a sleeping child, and she held him and walked and looked at the land that her grandfather had built something real on with 60 years of labor. She thought about Frank Bennett scraping dirt from his boots on the back porch. She thought about her mother signing documents in an attorney's office in Tucson, believing she had no choice. She thought about Ethan across a room at a fundraiser, looking at her with the expression she'd taken for genuine seeing. She thought about all of it, standing on the fence line of the Bennett property in the early June heat, and she let it be everything. It was the loss and the reclamation, and the irreducible fact that some things could be returned and some things could not, and that the returned things were not the same as the unbroken things, and that this was true, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. She was not okay in some clean, completed way. She was something more like intact. Stayed for 4 days. On the second day, she drove into the nearest town and met with a local attorney who was handling the title action, a practical woman named Del Reeves, who wore boots and spoke in the direct way of people who didn't spend energy on performance. They walked through the legal status. The title action was moving, expected to finalize within 3 months. Del had filed the necessary paperwork with the county and had the civil judgment certified for use in the Arizona proceedings. "What are you planning to do with it?" Del asked. Mara had been thinking about this since before the civil verdict. Since the morning she'd stood in Calder's office and heard about the other families. Since the moment Okafor had asked her how she was, and she'd said she was functional, and Okafor had said that wasn't what she'd asked. "I want to put a medical foundation here," Mara said. "Rural healthcare access. There's nothing within an hour of this property that serves the agricultural community. Farm workers, ranchers, seasonal workers, the population that doesn't have access to the kind of care that," she paused, "kind of care I know how to provide." Del looked at her. "That's a significant undertaking." "I know. You'd need funding beyond the restitution amount." "I know that too. I have people I can talk to." She looked out the window of Del's office at the main street of the small town, the hardware store and the feed supply and the diner and the flat blue sky above all of it. "My grandfather built something real here. I want to build something real here." Del nodded slowly. "I'll expedite the title action. Thank you." On the third day, she visited the county records office and pulled the original deed. Frank Bennett's name, in the county record, in the handwriting of a registrar from 1951. The original recording of ownership. She held the photocopy they gave her and stood in the parking lot of the county records office and looked at her grandfather's name in someone else's handwriting and felt the specific, unspectacular weight of something being restored, not fixed, not healed, not made as though it never happened, but restored, which was a different thing and the only honest thing. She drove back to the property that evening. She sat on the back porch, the same porch. The boards replaced at some point in the intervening decades, but the structure the same orientation, the same view of the fence line going out into the flat distance, and she put Miles in her lap and watched the sun go down behind the western edge of the property. Miles watched it too, with the wide-eyed focus he brought to light and color and movement, reaching one hand toward the last of the orange at the horizon. She thought about Ethan. She thought about him in the courtroom, looking at his hands. She thought about him on the courthouse steps in January, saying "I'm sorry" to her back. She had not responded to it then. She had not had the bandwidth for it, and she was not certain she would have known what to say even if she had. She knew now, sitting on the back porch of her grandfather's property in the June evening, with her son in her lap, what she would have said. Not that it was okay. It was not okay and would not become okay. There was no version of what Ethan Vale had done that simplified into acceptability, no frame that made the investigator's report, the false loan documents, or the folder labeled custody strategy into something understandable and therefore forgivable. But she would have said, "I see you." Not the way she'd thought she saw him, across a room at a fundraiser, the warmth and misread directness of a man she'd believed was finally paying attention. Not that kind of seeing. The seeing that came after. The kind that had no generosity in it, but also no distortion. The clear, unromantic sight of someone who understood another person completely and was done being affected by them. She saw him. He was a man who had been handed something that required dishonesty to maintain and had made the choice, repeatedly, over years, to maintain it. He was not a monster. Monsters were simpler than Ethan Vale. He was a man who had chosen wrong so many times in a row that the wrong had become the architecture of his life, and when the architecture was finally dismantled, he had nothing underneath it to stand on. She did not hate him. She had stopped having enough room for that. Miles turned from the sunset and looked at her face in the way he'd been doing more lately, studying her, reading her expression with the focused seriousness of a person learning to understand what faces meant. She looked back. "Hi," she said. He put his hand on her cheek. She covered it with her own hand. They stayed until the light was gone. Custody order finalized in July. Primary custody to Mara Bennett. Ethan was granted regular visitation unsupervised, after the 90-day completion 2 weekends per month and 1 evening per week. The order was written with the specificity of a document designed to last, covering school year schedules and holidays and the practical mechanics of 2 people raising a child from separate lives. She signed it in Calder's office. No courtroom, no ceremony. Just a conference table and a pen and Calder across from her, with a coffee he'd been forgetting to drink for an hour. She signed where indicated, turned the pages, signed again. When she finished, she put the pen down and sat for a moment. "How does it feel?" Calder asked. She thought about the honest answer. "It's real now," she said. "It was always real, but now it's documented." He nodded. "Calder." She looked at him across the conference table. This man who had answered a 6:15 a.m. phone call from a woman he'd last seen in an emergency department and had said, "Tell me everything," and had meant it. "You didn't have to do this the way you did it." He looked at her steadily. "Yes, I did." She accepted that. She picked up her copy of the order and put it in her folder beside her grandfather's photocopy deed and the nursing board clearance letter and the civil judgment and the photograph of the ranch from 9,987. She walked out of Calder's office and into a July afternoon that was hot and direct and smelled like the city exhaust and concrete and the hot metal smell of subway grates, and somewhere underneath it all the river, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment before she flagged a cab. She had to pick up Miles from the woman she'd found to watch him on work days, a warm and practical grandmother of 4 named June, who lived 4 blocks from the Brooklyn apartment and who Miles had taken to with the cheerful adaptability of a child who was securely attached and therefore not threatened by the existence of other caring adults. He would be awake, recently fed, probably crawling in the determined and slightly reckless way he'd started doing 3 weeks ago, launching himself toward things without full appreciation of what happened at the edge of them. He got that from her. She could see it in him already, the going toward. The cab came, she got in. She watched Manhattan move past the windows, the specific, indifferent, enormous life of a city that had held her marriage and her crisis and her slow reconstruction and had not paused for any of it, and did not pause now. And she thought about the Bennett Foundation, which she'd incorporated in May with Del Reeves's help, which had its first grant application submitted to a rural healthcare nonprofit fund, and its first donation committed from a colleague of Naomi Mercer's, who worked in philanthropic medicine. She thought about going back to Arizona in September, when the title action would be finalized, when she could stand on the property as the legal holder of the deed, not just the heir in process. She thought about what she wanted to build there, not as restitution as purpose. The thing she'd always been good at, showing up for people in the specific unglamorous moment when they needed someone who knew what they were doing and was willing to stay. Cab stopped in front of June's building. She paid and got out. She went up the stairs and knocked on June's door and heard from inside the particular kind of loud that a 9-month-old generated when he was fully awake and engaged with the world, and June opened the door and Miles was on the floor 3 feet away, stopped mid-crawl, looking at the door, at Mara's face, crouched down. He crawled to her at maximum speed, which was still not fast but was his fastest, arms and knees working, face arranged in the expression of complete and uncomplicated certainty. Caught him when he got there. She held him and he grabbed her hair and pulled, she always did, in which she'd stopped trying to prevent, and she laughed, a small, real sound, nothing performed about it, and said ow in the way she always said it, which he always found interesting, and today apparently found hilarious, because he laughed back, his whole body involved in it, the way infant laughter was, every part of him participating. She sat on June's floor and held her son, and felt the laugh move through her and let it. June stood in the doorway of her kitchen and watched them with the particular expression of a woman who had raised 4 children and understood what she was looking at. Outside, July moved on. 3 years later, the Bennett Foundation opened its first full-service clinic on the Arizona property. Not large 8 exam rooms, a small urgent care bay, a waiting room with good light. Del Reeves came to the opening. Calder came. Naomi Mercer came, 75 now, still practicing 2 days a week at Bellevue and showing no signs of stopping. Harlan Renner sent a letter, handwritten, which Mara read once and put in the folder she kept. Miles was 3.5 and wore a small button-down that he'd chosen himself from the 3 options she'd given him, and spent most of the opening ceremony examining the intake desk with the methodical interest he brought to new structures. He had her grandfather's quality of paying attention to things. She watched him from across the room and felt the particular texture of that not happiness exactly, which was too simple, but something more like rightness, the sensation of being in the correct place, doing the correct thing for the correct reasons. Naomi appeared at her elbow. "He looks like you," Naomi said. "He looks like himself," Mara said. Naomi made the sound that meant she was accepting a correction she didn't fully agree with and moving on. She looked around the clinic, the good light, the clean examination rooms, visible through the windows, the small waiting room already set up with the kind of practical comfort that Mara had specified down to the chairs. Your grandfather would have liked this. Mara looked at the building. At the land around it, the same flat red distance she'd walked with Miles on her hip 2 years ago, the same mineral smell of dry Arizona morning. Yes, she said. He would. The federal case against Ethan Vale had resulted in a civil enforcement action. Not criminal prosecution. Okafor had made the call that the personal criminal standard wasn't met, and Mara had accepted that with the equanimity of someone who had already received what she'd actually come for. The enforcement stripped the remaining Valcroft-derived assets, the ones that hadn't already been lost to the collapse of Vale Capital, and distributed them through the restitution process. She heard about Ethan, occasionally. Not from him, he had maintained the custody schedule with the mechanical consistency of a man fulfilling an obligation, arriving on time, returning Miles on time, doing nothing to make the process difficult and nothing to make it warm. He lived in a smaller apartment now. He worked in financial consulting, solo, the kind of careful reduced-scale work available to men whose names were associated with federal investigations, but who were not themselves convicted. He was not destroyed. She had not destroyed him and had not tried to. He was diminished and accountable and continuing, which was what accountability actually produced, not annihilation, just the specific, ongoing weight of consequence. She had stopped thinking about him as much as she'd expected to. She thought about her mother more. She thought about Patricia Bennett standing in Harlan Renner's office in Tucson, being told she had a debt she didn't know about, believing she had failed her father, signing documents she'd been told she had no choice but to sign. She thought about that woman every time she walked into the clinic. Not with grief, exactly. With the kind of dedication that grief transformed into when it had somewhere to go. The last patient of the opening day, they were doing walk-in hours. As part of the opening, symbolic and practical, both was a man in his 60s, a farm worker, who had a wound on his forearm. He'd been managing himself for 3 weeks because the nearest care was an hour away, and he couldn't leave during the harvest. She cleaned and dressed it. She asked when he'd last had a tetanus update. She told him he needed antibiotics and wrote the prescription and explained the course clearly. He said, "How much?" She said, "We're sliding scale. What can you manage?" He named a number that was not much. She said, "That works." He looked at her with the specific look of a person who was not accustomed to things being easier than they expected. She understood that look. She saw it in the mirror sometimes. Still, even now, the residual wariness of someone who had learned that ease was usually a setup. She understood it and did not try to talk him out of it. She just finished the dressing and gave him the prescription and shook his hand and said she'd see him in 2 weeks for a follow-up. He left. She'd stood in the exam room for a moment after he went, looking at the clean surface of the counter, the organized tools, the good light coming through the window. Outside, the Arizona afternoon was bright and serious with heat. Miles was in the waiting room with Calder, who was showing him something on his phone with the slightly baffled generosity of a man who did not entirely understand children, but was willing to try. Naomi was talking to Del Reeves near the front entrance. Clinic was quiet the way the right places were quiet, not empty, just settled, full of the kind of potential that lived in spaces built for specific, useful purposes. Mara washed her hands. She looked at her hands under the water, the same hands that had worked trauma bays and signed legal documents and held her son and written 12 pages of precise time-stamped notes, and carried her grandfather's photograph in a leather folder and touched the cold glass of a 43rd floor window at 3 in the morning, wondering if she was going to make it through. She had made it through. Not cleanly. Not without cost. Not in a way that erased what had been taken or what had been lost or the specific, irreducible fact that her mother had spent years believing she had failed when she had only been deceived. Through. She turned off the water. She dried her hands. She walked out of the exam room, into the waiting room, where Miles looked up from Calder's phone when he heard her footsteps and said, "Mama," the way he always said it, not urgent, not needy, just a statement of orientation, the way you named a fixed point. "Hi," she said. "We going home?" he asked. She looked at her son. Clinic around them. At the window, and the Arizona land visible through it, the land her grandfather had built something real on. The land that had her name on it now. The land that was becoming something new without forgetting what it had always been. "Yes," she said. She held out her hand. He took it. They walked out into the afternoon.